Blood is just pigment. The only thing that truly destroys you is the time you spend watching it dry. If you are still here, don't just watch. Subscribe. You'll want to hear the rest. I slid the envelope right next to the white porcelain plate, the only thing on that table that wasn't gold. The light that afternoon streamed through Harrison's bay windows in the dining room, and every speck of dust in the air, every particle of gold on the china, screamed of success. A success built on a chalk foundation, a foundation I was about to soak. My Uncle Harrison carved the turkey, like he did every year. It was a massive bird, roasted to perfection, the skin cracking under the silver blade, a sound that was, for me, the noise of normalcy, the muffled echo of a life I had sought to reclaim for too long. The heat of the oven still clung to the open kitchen air, mingling with the lingering scent of sage, butter, and the icy vanity that filled this Hampton's house. Every Thanksgiving, the ritual was immutable. The same immaculate linen tablecloth, the same inherited silverware, the same fixed smiles on the faces of my aunt, Elara, and my cousins, and Harrison, with his large, steady hands, his paternal smile, the undisputed patriarch of the lineage, carving the fowl as he carved the financial markets of Wall Street, with surgical precision and a total absence of emotion. That was the man the world saw, solid, generous, prosperous. He was also the man who, 11 years ago, had looked my father in the eye and let him drown. Not in water, in debt, in humiliation, in that financial abyss he had himself dug, promising the help that never came. I was sitting in my usual place, between Elara and my youngest cousin Willow. Willow, who studied literature at Columbia, and always wore that expression of slightly melancholy innocence that I recognized, the innocence of those who have never had to look into the dark. I felt the texture of the table's polished wood beneath my fingers, cold and smooth, contrasting with the clammy warmth of my own palm. I had rehearsed this moment hundreds of times in my head, ever since I first understood the truth, 6 years ago. The truth that wasn't a simple business accident, but a calculated betrayal, a meticulous knife in the back, followed by a silent legal takeover of my father's last asset, an act that Harrison had magnificently laundered under the cloak of family rescue and unfortunate bad luck. The envelope. It was off-white, heavy, unsealed. A subtle detail. It could have contained a poem or a thank-you note for the past year. Right next to him, the turkey exhaled its last vapors. "To the family's health," Harrison said, his voice low, resonant, the perfect timbre of a man who never had to shout to be heard. He raised his half-full glass of sumptuous burgundy. "And to the health of everything we have built together." Our eyes met. His eye was a clear, piercing blue, a gaze that never lingered, that assessed, and moved on. But in mine, there was the weight of those 6 years of work, of night studies, of canvassing in the freezing mud of low-end real estate to reach the level where I could, finally, touch him, return the favor. "To family," I replied, my own voice strangely steady, almost a whisper. I brought to my lips the wine that was, ironically, a label my father loved. Harrison, with the assurance of a man who has nothing to hide, reached for his plate. He took the silver blade and began to serve the first slice of breast, his hand perfectly still. And then he saw the envelope. He looked at it as one looks at a displaced object, something that is not in its proper place on an otherwise perfect surface. He frowned, a subtle movement that was the only expression I knew him to have when he was intrigued or annoyed. "What is this, James?" he asked politely. He only called me by my name to mark distance or authority. Normally, I was my boy. "It's a series of photos," I said, my heart beating at a slow, painful rhythm against my ribs, like a heavy hammer underwater. Not of the turkey, of what it took to pay for this house. Elara cleared her throat, a small nervous thing trying to blend into the sound of plates. Willow put down her fish knife. The air, a moment earlier saturated with the smell of food and family, became a thin sheet of glass. Harrison stopped carving. The shining blade rested against the turkey platter. He picked up the envelope. His fingers were thick, manicured, the type of hands that signed six-figure checks without shaking. He turned it over, then, with calculated slowness, withdrew the contents. The photos. They were black and white, an aesthetic choice I had found appropriate for this kind of raw truth. The first was the bill of sale, the real one, the one my father had signed under duress, the document that sealed the transfer of his entire stake in the family business, that business founded by our grandfather, to a shell company based in the Cayman Islands, a shell company created by Harrison, just 2 weeks before promising him the loan that would have saved him. The second showed bank statements, transfers between this company and Harrison's personal account in the months following my father's death. Precise figures, dates, the money, the real money, my father's blood money, had financed the first down payment on this summer residence. Not a coincidence. Compensation. The third image was not a document. It was a photograph of my father, sitting alone in his office, the lights dim, the day before the official collapse. He held a simple silver ring in his hands, the ring my mother had given him and which he ended up selling a few days later to pay the salaries of his last employees. A ring that Harrison had bought back at an anonymous antique auction and that I had found, by chance, a year ago, in a drawer in his office, a simple, worthless trinket for him, the symbolic object of his silent triumph. The silence in the dining room was so thick I could almost taste the metal. Elara was no longer looking at the turkey. She was staring at the crystal chandelier, as if she hoped her concentration could make it fall and break this scene. Willow was frozen, her eyes wide and tearful, the shock making her look younger, almost childlike. Harrison did not speak immediately. He leafed through the photos with the same calm he used to peruse a financial report. His face betrayed nothing. No panic, no indignation. Simply analysis. Finally, he looked up. His gaze was cold. The azure had turned to ice. "Where did you get these, James?" His voice was soft, dangerously polite. 6 years of my time," I replied, a bitter smile stretching my lips. I hadn't smiled like that since I was a kid. I studied law, not to plead, Harrison, to learn how the devil hides his funds. I had help, a man named Mr. Davies, an old partner of Dad's. He never forgot what you did. He showed me everything. He opened the doors for me. Harrison put the photos down. He took his linen napkin, unfolded it slowly, and placed it on his lap. The gesture was disconcertingly elegant. It was his way of telling me that he was not a man who lost his cool, even when trapped. "You've gone to a lot of trouble for documents no one will believe," he said. "Copies, James. Anyone can fabricate copies." "Ah, but it's not the original documents that matter," I said, tilting my head. "What matters is that they point to where to find them. They're not for the FBI, Harrison. They're for your wife." I felt Elara's burning gaze on me, but I didn't look at her. My attention remained fixed on my uncle's chiseled face. "Elara is not stupid, James. She knows how business works." Flashback. 6 years earlier, a rainy day in Boston. I am sitting in Mr. Davies' office, the little man with the sad eyes, the smell of old ink and damp leather. He showed me the flowchart, Harrison's subtle maneuver to buy my father's debt from a phantom bank just before promising him a rescue. "It was perfect, James," Davies had said, his voice a whisper. "The kind of betrayal you only see in movies. He didn't break anything. He just let your father choose the right rope." I remember the way the rain beat against the window pane, each drop a reflection of a tear I refused to shed. Davies added, "Your Aunt Elara, she has a keen sense of loyalty, but above all, she has an absolute aversion to vulgarity. And fraud, my boy, is vulgar, even when it's legal." End of flashback. "She doesn't believe in fraud," I corrected. "She believes in decency, and she believes in legacy. Dirty money, Harrison, is like bad wine. It doesn't go with a linen tablecloth. And these photos," I tapped the table, "are just a preview of the investigation I conducted. What's interesting is what I told Willow." Willow raised her head, her eyes misty. She hadn't yet understood the game. She saw the aggression, not the justification. "I didn't tell Willow anything, James. I told you everything. A year ago, you came to see me, after selling your first apartment, to ask if I could help you find an investment firm for your gains. You told me you didn't just want to make money, you wanted to understand how to make it. And I told you everything. I told you that to succeed, you had to be smarter, faster, and sometimes, yes, more ruthless than the others. I shared a few stories from my early days. Stories that aren't necessarily in the books. I was honest with you." The tension was unbearable. Elara, sensing that the conversation was slipping out of the realm of business and into that of personal morality, placed her hand on her husband's arm. "Harrison, what are you—" "Sit down, Elara," Harrison ordered, his voice low, but with an authority that extinguished the fire in his wife's eyes. She sat down, but her hands were clasped around the edge of the table, knuckles white. "You don't have the talent for this, James," Harrison said, his voice regaining its calm, analytical tone, as if discussing a bad stock trade. "You have the photos and a bit of resentment, but you don't have the mastery. I would have caught you." Flashback. 2 months earlier, on a New York rooftop terrace. The wind was cold, but the view of Manhattan was spectacular. I was talking to Mr. Davies, whose eyes were even sadder than last time. "Harrison thinks he's untouchable," he had told me. "He sees you as a child, not a rival. That's his greatest weakness. He'll let you into his system because he thinks you're incapable of hacking it. He'll show you the lock to please you. He'll never suspect you've already made an impression of the key." Davies took a drag from his cigarette. "The money you took, James, make sure it's enough to make him look ridiculous, not just to hurt him. Humiliation is the only currency these men understand." End of flashback. "You were right," I said, playing with his calmness. "I struggled with the signature, but I paid attention to this detail. You sign with a fountain pen, a heavy Mont Blanc. I stole the ink from your house 3 weeks ago, the same shade, the same pressure, and more importantly, the timing was perfect. I acted while you were certain I was at a charity dinner I organized." I pointed to the photos on the table. "By the way, the photos you got tonight, they were in my suitcase. I haven't sent them to anyone. Not yet." Harrison understood. He understood the icy logic of my maneuver. "You told me last year that if you wanted to steal from someone and get away with it, you had to do it in such an elegant way that even the victim would doubt it. I took the money and created a file of damning documents for Elara. Documents that, if they end up on a divorce lawyer's desk, won't cost you $80 million. They'll cost you half of everything you have, and they'll get you thrown out of your own company." There was sweat on his forehead. For the first time in my life, I saw Harrison Wells sweat. "What do you want?" His voice had become hoarse again. The rest of the family watched, frozen like pillars of salt. Elara had her hand to her mouth. Willow was crying silently, her tears mingling with the red of her blouse. "I want 2 things," I said. I reached out and picked up the silver ring, my father's ring, which I had slipped from his drawer this morning. "I want this ring back. It's not a trinket anymore. It's mine." Harrison said nothing, but his gaze followed the object. He knew what that ring represented to me, and what it cost him to see me take it. And the second thing, I continued, my voice lowering until it was almost inaudible, you will give me a signed non-disclosure agreement, under oath, this very evening, stating that you will not prosecute the person who took that money. Not for the money, Harrison, but because you can't afford to divorce Elara, not with what I have, and you can't afford for this story of offshore company and betrayal to come out in the press. That's the price for your reputation, and for my mother's secret. Harrison straightened up. Your mother's secret? What are you talking about, James? I looked at him with unexpected gentleness. This was the part I was most afraid to articulate, the moment when revenge merged with confession. You destroyed my father, I said, but you also destroyed my mother. She found the papers, Harrison, not the real ones, not the Cayman ones, but the first letters, the bank statements you sent Dad to corner him. She found them. She understood that he was losing everything and that you were behind it all, and that's why she... I felt a knot forming in my throat, but I untied it, with the same cold blood I had used for the rest. That's why she could never recover from the pressure. She couldn't bear to see the man she loved break. So she took the pills, Harrison. 6 months after the company collapsed, and you knew it. You came to the funeral. You held me in your arms. But you knew why she did it. You knew it was your greed that killed her. I saw the truth in his eyes. He remembered. He remembered the farewell letter, the one that was never made public, the one where she wrote how sorry she was that my father had to face the enormity of the betrayal. I told Elara you were giving me a large check to get started in finance, I said. I told Willow you were my mentor. But what I'm going to tell the press, Harrison, is that I took the money to pay for the justice you stole, and that I kept the real evidence, not for the money, but for your guilt. There was a long silence. It poured into the emptiness of the room. Harrison, finally, slumped back in his chair. He looked around. The gaudy luxury, the cold meal, the broken family, everything he had built. You haven't changed, James, he said. You're just as ruthless as I am. I know, I said, my voice shaking with a fatigue I hadn't felt in years. But the difference, Harrison, is that I'm doing it to get rid of this burden. You did it to create one for yourself. He took his glass of wine, emptied it in one gulp. Then, with a still trembling hand, he wrote 3 words on the back of one of the photos. Okay, it's done. He handed me the photo. It was the photo of my father with the ring. He had written, "You won." I took the photo. This was the moment to get out of this nightmare. I stood up. The chair scraped on the floor. The sound was brutal. Happy Thanksgiving, Harrison? I turned to Elara. Her face was ravaged, but she said nothing. She understood. She understood the vulgarity of her husband's betrayal. She understood the price of my silence. And Willow. She looked at me, her eyes flooded. She asked me, "Are you a monster, James?" I stopped at the door, my hand on the cold handle of the living room. No, Willow, I said softly. I just decided the monster had to pay his bill. I walked out. The sun hit the stucco facade. The air was cold, but the ring in my pocket was already warm. The game was over. The money was safe. The truth was revealed, at least to those who needed to hear it. I had taken revenge, and I had left the guilt behind. Twist. Revelation. It was only later, in the taxi taking me back to New York, that I looked at the photo of my father, the glass of wine Harrison had drunk, his hand shaking to write the note, those 3 words, "You won." There was one thing Harrison didn't know. The non-disclosure agreement I wanted was not for the money. It was for the photos. The photos I had slipped next to his plate tonight were not the originals. They were copies of the ones I had already sent the day before to Mr. Davies, with very precise instructions. He won't prosecute anyone because he still believes in Alara's secret. But what I didn't tell Harrison is that Mr. Davies, who had such sad eyes, had been diagnosed with terminal cancer, and he won't keep his secret any longer than his next letter to the New York Times. Harrison is trapped. He gave power to a man who has nothing left to lose. I'm sitting in the dark, the silence of the cab, the only real thing. The ring is on my finger. I have my justice, a cold, elegant, and now empty dish. But there is always another secret, another scar that must be confessed to truly move on. If this story still echoes in you, stay, subscribe, before the next truth finds you first.